Chapter 8, Part 3 of Queen Victoria. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Queen Victoria by Giles Lytton Strachey. Chapter 8, Part 3. But she was reserved for a very different fate. The outburst of republicanism had been, in fact, the last flicker of an expiring cause. The Liberal tide, which had been flowing steadily ever since the Reform Bill, reached its height with Mr. Gladstone's first administration, and towards the end of that administration the inevitable ebb began. The reaction, when it came, was sudden and complete. The general election of 1874 changed the whole face of politics. Mr. Gladstone and the Liberals were routed, and the Tory party, for the first time for over 40 years, attained an unquestioned supremacy in England. It was obvious that their surprising triumph was preeminently due to the skill and vigour of Disraeli. He returned to office, no longer the dubious commander of an insufficient host, but with drums beating and flags flying, a conquering hero. And as a conquering hero, Victoria welcomed her new Prime Minister. Then there followed 6 years of excitement, of enchantment, of felicity, of glory, of romance. The amazing being who now at last, at the age of 70, after a lifetime of extraordinary struggles, had turned into reality the absurdest of his boyhood's dreams, knew well enough how to make his own, with absolute completeness, the heart of the sovereign lady whose servant and whose master he had so miraculously become. In women's hearts he had always read as in an open book. His whole career had turned upon those curious entities, and the more curious they were, the more intimately at home with them he seemed to be. But Lady Beaconsfield, with her cracked idolatry, and Mrs. Bridges Williams, with her clogs, her corpulence, and her legacy, were gone, and an even more remarkable phenomenon stood in their place. He surveyed what was before him with the eye of a past master, and he was not for a moment at a loss. He realised everything: the interacting complexities of circumstance and character, the pride of place mingled so inextricably with personal arrogance, the superabundant emotionalism, the ingenuousness of outlook, the solid, the laborious respectability shot through so incongruously by temperamental cravings for the coloured and the strange, the singular intellectual limitations, and the mysteriously essential female elements impregnating every particle of the whole. A smile hovered over his impassive features, and he dubbed Victoria the Fairy. The name delighted him, for, with that epigrammatic ambiguity so dear to his heart, it precisely expressed his vision of the Queen. The Spenserian allusion was very pleasant, the elegant evocations of Gloriana; but there was more in it than that. There was the suggestion of a diminutive creature endowed with magical and mythical properties, and a portentousness almost ridiculously out of keeping with the rest of her make-up. The Fairy, he determined, should henceforward wave her wand for him alone. Detachment is always a rare quality, and rarest of all, perhaps, among politicians, but that veteran egotist possessed it in a supreme degree. Not only did he know what he had to do, not only did he do it, he was in the audience as well as on the stage, and he took in, with the rich relish of a connoisseur, every feature of the entertaining situation, every phase of the delicate drama, and every detail of his own consummate performance. The smile hovered and vanished, and, bowing low with Oriental gravity and Oriental submissiveness, he set himself to his task. He had understood from the first that in dealing with the Fairy the appropriate method of approach was the very antithesis of the Gladstonian, and such a method was naturally his. It was not his habit to harangue and exhort and expatiate in official conscientiousness. He liked to scatter flowers along the path of business, to compress a weighty argument into a happy phrase, to insinuate what was in his mind with an air of friendship and confidential courtesy. He was nothing if not personal, and he had perceived that personality was the key that opened the Faery's heart. Accordingly, he never for a moment allowed his intercourse with her to lose the personal tone. He invested all the transactions of state with the charms of familiar conversation. She was always the royal lady, the adored and revered mistress, he the devoted and respectful friend. When once the personal relation was firmly established, every difficulty disappeared. But to maintain that relation uninterruptedly in a smooth and even course, a particular care was necessary. The bearings had to be most assiduously oiled. Nor was Disraeli in any doubt as to the nature of the lubricant. "You have heard me called a flatterer," he said to Matthew Arnold, "and it is true. Everyone likes flattery, and when you come to royalty you should lay it on with a trowel." He practised what he preached. His adulation was incessant, and he applied it in the very thickest slabs. "There is no honour and no reward," he declared, "that with him can ever equal the possession of your Majesty's kind thoughts. All his own thoughts and feelings and duties and affections are now concentrated in your Majesty, and he desires nothing more for his remaining years than to serve your Majesty, or if that service ceases, to live still on its memory as a period of his existence most interesting and fascinating. In life," he told her, "one must have for one's thoughts a sacred depository, and Lord Beaconsfield ever presumes to seek that in his sovereign mistress." She was not only his own solitary support, she was the one prop of the state. "If your Majesty is ill," he wrote during a grave political crisis, "he is sure he will himself break down. All really depends upon your Majesty. He lives only for her," he asseverated, "and works only for her, and without her all is lost." When her birthday came, he produced an elaborate confection of hyperbolic compliment. "Today Lord Beaconsfield ought fitly perhaps to congratulate a powerful sovereign on her imperial sway, the vastness of her empire, and the success and strength of her fleets and armies. But he cannot. His mind is in another mood. He can only think of the strangeness of his destiny, that it has come to pass that he should be the servant of one so great, and whose infinite kindness, the brightness of whose intelligence, and the firmness of whose will have enabled him to undertake labours to which he otherwise would be quite unequal, and supported him in all things by a condescending sympathy which in the hour of difficulty alike charms and inspires. Upon the sovereign of many lands and many hearts may an omnipotent Providence shed every blessing that the wise can desire and the virtuous deserve." In those expert hands the trowel seemed to assume the qualities of some lofty Masonic symbol, to be the ornate and glittering vehicle of verities unrealised by the profane. Such tributes were delightful, but they remained in the nebulous region of words, and Disraeli had determined to give his blandishments a more significant solidity. He deliberately encouraged those high views of her own position which had always been native to Victoria's mind, and had been reinforced by the principles of Albert and the doctrines of Stockmar. He professed to a belief in a theory of the Constitution which gave the sovereign a leading place in the councils of government, but his pronouncements upon the subject were indistinct, and when he emphatically declared that there ought to be a real throne, it was probably with the mental addition that the throne would be a very unreal one indeed whose occupant was unamenable to his cajoleries. But the vagueness of his language was in itself an added stimulant to Victoria. Skilfully confusing the woman and the Queen, he threw with a grandiose gesture the government of England at her feet, as if in doing so he were performing an act of personal homage. In his first audience after returning to power, he assured her that whatever she wished should be done. When the intricate Public Worship Regulation Bill was being discussed by the Cabinet,